Multi-tiered Systems of Support in Reading, MTSSR, Evaluation and Planning. Here are the session objectives for this workshop. You'll be able to identify the basic elements of MTSSR, or Multi-Tiered Systems of Support in Reading. You'll identify how MTSSR can improve student reading outcomes. You'll be able to identify the key steps that are needed to set up and use MTSSR effectively. And then you'll be evaluating your current MTSSR implementation, and you'll use analysis of that data to prioritize your greatest area of focus to support instruction and intervention at your school. You'll be able to create an action plan for that prioritized area of focus, and then you should be preparing for implementation. Let's start with an overview of multi-tiered systems of support in reading.
Teaching students to read successfully is one of the most important and challenging responsibilities of schools. Students who have difficulty reading not only are missing an important and enjoyable life skill, but they are far more likely than good readers to have difficulty with other school subjects, to drop out of school early, and to experience diminished education and employment opportunities throughout their lives. Reading problems remain the single greatest challenge schools face. Many schools are turning to a system called MTSSR to provide better reading instruction to all students. MTSSR stands for Multi-Tiered Systems of Support in Reading. What is MTSSR? MTSSR is a comprehensive system of reading instruction where the needs of all students are carefully and systematically addressed. All educators in the school focus on two main objectives. First, for those students who are on track for reading success, meaning they are reading at grade level, the school makes sure these students stay on track by providing high-quality reading instruction. Second, for those students who are not on track for reading success, meaning they are reading below grade level, the school provides the reading interventions necessary to help them get on track. Then, once these students are on track, the school makes sure they stay on track. These are the key objectives of MTSSR. What does an effective MTSSR look like? For a school to implement MTSSR effectively, it must do 5 major things really well. First, to keep students on track for reading success, high-quality reading instruction must be provided for all students. This is called core, or Tier 1 reading instruction. The school must also provide effective reading interventions for students who are not on track. Tier 2 interventions supplement and enhance Tier 1 instruction. This means that Tier 2 is always provided in addition to Tier 1 for students who require more support. For students who do not make progress with Tier 1 and Tier 2 instruction, highly intensive Tier 3 interventions are provided to meet individual student reading needs. Second, schools must know which students are on track for reading success and which students are not on track, so they can provide the reading instruction students need. Assessing students' reading skills directly and frequently is the best way to do this. Schools must also regularly monitor the progress of students who are not on track to make sure they are making good progress. Also, because MTSSR is a data-driven process, meaning the school uses data to make ongoing improvements to the system, the school must collect and use multiple sources of MTSSR implementation data to continuously improve MTSSR implementation and student outcomes. Third, all reading teachers, those who provide Tier 1 instruction and those who provide Tier 2 and 3 interventions, must have ongoing support, training, professional development, and coaching to provide the best reading instruction possible. The school must allocate the resources, time, and personnel for adequate training and support. The school must also ensure that all other educators in the building, the principal, coaches, specialists, and paraprofessionals, get the training they need to effectively implement and support MTSSR. Fourth, for all students, but especially for students who are not on track for reading success, families and schools must work together to ensure the reading needs of the student are met both inside and outside of school. This involves effective communication between the family and school, close collaboration, and regular monitoring. Families also play a vital role inside the school to support MTSSR by serving on leadership teams and helping to support students directly. Fifth, high-quality implementation of MTSSR requires school leadership. MTSSR leadership teams oversee all major aspects of implementation. Key leaders, including the principal, reading coaches, and lead grade level teachers, are actively engaged in the work. So, why does MTSSR hold promise for improving reading instruction and student reading outcomes? The fact that MTSSR is a comprehensive system of reading instruction means all educators in the building are working toward the same objectives: keeping students on track for reading success and supporting students who are not on track to get on track. As part of MTSSR, educators work toward these objectives in a consistent manner across all tiers of instruction. Instructional delivery in Tier 1 is similar from classroom to classroom and from one grade to the next. Reading interventions in Tier 2 are linked to core instruction and are aligned across classrooms and grades. The process of planning and delivering intense Tier 3 interventions is clear and systematic. Student data and implementation data is collected on a regular basis. Data is used consistently throughout the school to make decisions about the effectiveness of MTSSR. An emphasis on consistency creates enormous opportunities for the school to put in place a system of training, professional development, educator and parent support, and ongoing coaching for teachers, specialists, and administrators that is laser-focused on key objectives, is highly efficient, and is data-driven.
What are the key elements for effective MTSSR implementation? First, you have core reading instruction and intervention. So providing students the appropriate instruction in order for them to stay on track for reading success, that you must provide that high quality reading instruction. The school must also provide effective reading interventions for students who aren't on track. Second, schools must know which students are on track for reading success and which students are not on track. That's element 2, which is data use. Schools must also regularly monitor the progress of students who are not on track to make sure they are making good progress. Again, assessing students' reading progress directly is the best way to do this. Third, all reading teachers, those who provide Tier 1 instruction and those who provide Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions, must have that ongoing support, training, professional development, and coaching to provide the best reading instruction possible. This is element 3, professional development and coaching. Fourth, high-quality implementation of MTSSR is not possible nor sustainable without school leadership. This is element 4, MTSSR school leadership. And finally, all students, but especially for students who are not on track for reading success, families and schools must work together to ensure the reading needs of the students are met both inside and outside of school. This is element 5, mutual support involving families and schools. How does a school implement MTSSR? First, a school needs to do two things before they take on the challenge of implementing a comprehensive MTSSR system. First, the school should make a commitment to implement 5 major elements of MTSSR that we discussed on the last slide. Second, the school should engage in a comprehensive self-evaluation of their current reading approach. This self-evaluation or reading system audit will help the school determine what their major priorities should be in building or solidifying their MTSSR system. You will use a MTSSR implementation checklist to evaluate your current MTSSR approach for each of the elements that were described. We'll be doing that throughout the course of this workshop today. So what are those things that you're going to do first to set up a strong foundation for MTSSR implementation? The school should establish a school-wide MTSSR leadership team with the school principal as the team leader. The team should also include the school reading coach, reading specialist, at least one classroom teacher from each grade, and at least 1 or 2 parent or family members. This team has many responsibilities, but the most important are establishing or solidifying the MTSSR system and using data to oversee the systematic implementation and improvement of MTSSR and student reading outcomes. The MTSSR leadership team should establish and support strong classroom instruction and intervention, or PLCs, professional learning communities. A professional learning community team or something similar should make sure reading teachers can plan and work together on issues related to providing high-quality reading instruction and intervention in the classroom. The school should also establish a school-wide schedule of reading instruction. This includes specifying the time each day core reading instruction Tier 2 or Tier 1 and reading interventions Tier 2 and 3 are taught. Scheduling should be done for all grades in all classrooms. The school should determine what core reading instruction is and how it will be taught. The Tier 1 program should precisely specify what and how students are taught throughout the year. If students are successful learning the Tier 1 program, they should be on track for reading success. The school should determine what the Tier 2 interventions will be and how Tier 3 interventions will be adopted or developed with the individual needs of students in mind. Both Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions should precisely specify what and how students are taught. If students are successful in these interventions, they should be catching up to their peers who are on track for reading success. If students are not making progress in the Tier 2 and Tier 3 intervention, the intensity of the intervention should be increased to improve student reading outcomes. The school should directly assess all students in reading to determine which students are on track for reading success and which students are not on track for reading success. Data from these universal screening assessments, meaning all students are assessed, should be used to help determine which students will receive Tier 1 reading instruction only and which students will need a combination of Tier 1 instruction and either a Tier 2 or Tier 3 intervention to help support their needs. Universal screening assessment should be conducted 2 or 3 times a year. As schools establish their MTSSR foundation in these 3 critical areas, they should also begin putting in place the support system necessary to make sure the foundation is solid and the MTSSR implementation and student reading outcomes improve continuously over time. What are those support systems? First, the school must ensure that student reading data and MTSSR implementation data are collected and used in a data-driven way. In addition to universal screening data, systematic progress data should be collected with students who receive intervention. And in some cases, reading data should be collected to plan instruction for a student and determine how well some students are learning precisely what is being taught during instruction. Implementation data should also be collected on all key elements of MTSSR to continuously improve implementation. Resources should also be earmarked and processes and procedures established for all the training, professional development, coaching, teaming, and collaboration necessary to ensure that teachers, administrators, specialists, and parents receive the training and support necessary to implement MTSSR effectively. The school and family should collaboratively establish a co-communication system related specifically to MTSSR. This communication system should detail the opportunities families have to learn about MTSSR and how they can help support MTSSR implementation both inside of school and outside of school. It would detail the learning and training opportunities for families, how families provide important input on reading interventions for their child, and how schools provide regular feedback to parents on how their child is learning to read. As schools establish their MTSSR foundation in these three critical areas, they should also begin putting in place the support system necessary to make sure the foundation is solid and the MTSSR implementation and student reading outcomes improve continuously over time. Your team will engage in a comprehensive self-evaluation of your current reading approach during the session today. This self-evaluation or reading system audit will help guide your team in using a continuous improvement cycle to determine what your major priorities should be for action planning in building or solidifying your system. We do want to make sure that there's a bridge between the knowing and the doing gap. I'm going to read this quote by Pfeiffer and Sutton. You're likely to find talk substituting for action when no follow-up is done to ensure that what was said is actually done. People forget that merely making a decision doesn't change anything. It's important to remember as we go through this process, what we can change is enough to make a difference in literacy achievement with children. Today, we will review the MTSS-R checklist and begin scoring. We will also review how to collect and summarize student data and implementation data to comprehensively evaluate the current system that you have in place. As we said before, the tool we're going to use is called the MTSSR Implementation Checklist. And you can see on here that the 5 elements that we discussed in this overview, core instruction and intervention, data use, professional development and coaching, MTSSR school leadership, and mutual support involving families and the school will all be evaluated using this tool. Once you've evaluated your data, your team will examine and analyze the data to gauge the health of your current system and determine the overall level of priority for action planning. You will be examining student data, the MTSS-R checklist data, and instruction and intervention implementation data to help guide this prioritization. On the MTSS-R checklist, we have prioritized items on each element to assist your teams in planning your goals and actions. The items are prioritized based on phases of implementation. Phase 1 of the implementation are the readiness activities. Phase 2 of implementation are the initial implementation activities, and phase 3 are the advanced implementation activities. For phase 1 readiness activities, these items are going to help you get ready for that high quality implementation. So some of the goals that we have for readiness are establishing leadership teams, which we've talked about in this overview, and we'll talk about more today as well. Establishing school staff knowledge of the science of reading and evidence-based instructional strategies. That was also one of the activities or one of the sessions that we've had in the series of training. Establish effective data-driven MTSSR leadership and PLC teams. And establish school MTSSR system infrastructure for high-quality implementation. For the elements that are earmarked as phase 2 or initial implementation, this is moving your school into the high quality implementation of all MTSSR elements. So establishing high quality school-based implementation of the key MTSSR elements, establishing high-quality reading staff implementation of the science of reading and evidence-based instructional strategies, so moving beyond knowledge to implementation, and expanding on MTSSR leadership and PLC use of data to inform instructional adjustments. And then finally, we want to move to phase 3 activities or advanced implementation. This is where your school will be refining those high quality implementation of all MTSSR elements. So these items focus on data-driven refinement of high-quality school-based implementation of key MTSSR elements, data-driven refinement of high-quality reading staff implementation of the science of reading and evidence-based instructional strategies, and data-driven refinement of those MTSSR leadership and PLC teams' use of data to inform instructional adjustments. So you'll be reviewing student data as well as the checklist to help you determine where your priorities should be. You'll use your universal screening data to determine the percentage of students at each of the 3 risk indicators: low risk, some risk, and at risk, or those students that are at those benchmark goals, those students that are at risk. And you'll use these indicators to determine the level of priority the school should assign to improving reading instruction and intervention. So let's look at this example. We want to make sure that we're trying to always work through that school goal of 80% of students performing in the low risk or core range. So we want to look at our beginning of the year benchmark assessment or our universal screener, and we want to determine what is the percentage of students we have in our school that are in that low risk range. In the example that we have here, there's only 50% of the students at that low risk, in that low risk category. If we look at the chart to the left, we see that 50% is showing us that there is a high priority for focus on core reading instruction. When we look at the supplemental intervention and that there's 22%, that would be a moderate priority according to our table. And we look at the percentage of students at risk requiring that intensive intervention. Again, that is in the high priority category. So what we need to do next then is look at the order of priority for tiers of instruction. The first priority for what we want to focus on is core instruction, tier 1. That instruction that all students are receiving. We want to make sure that we're providing the highest quality instruction for all students within that first preventative tier in order to prevent students from needing intensive interventions later. If we're meeting our goal for core instruction, then we'll move on and prioritize supplemental intervention or tier 1, and then we'll move on and prioritize intensive intervention or tier 3. So when we look at our example from this school here, our highest priority of focus is going to be on core instruction or tier 1. Schools will implementation data later on in the year and at each data summit throughout the year, middle of the year, and end of the year to determine, to be another data source to determine their priorities. So you want to focus on implementation data from the high priority tiers or grade levels identified from the student data. And then you want to look at that implementation data. Is instruction being delivered as intended? Are lessons followed as written? And are explicit and systematic elements of instruction delivered correctly? These would also become priorities for focusing our actions on improving our systems. And then for the third part of our continuous improvement cycle, we want to make sure that we create an action plan for those prioritized areas of focus. So first, we're going to determine an overall instruction and intervention goal. And then we'll review the MTSS-R checklist, scored items, and describe actions necessary that will support that prioritized instruction and intervention goal. So you'll look at each of the elements, instruction and intervention, determine actions that will support that goal. You'll determine data use actions, PD and coaching actions, leadership actions, and mutual support involving families and the school actions. And then the last part of the continuous improvement cycle is implement. So how are you going to carry out the action plan and then collect implementation and student performance data to continue that cycle? So first, you'll need to communicate the action plan with all stakeholders, execute the action plan, provide ongoing support and professional development to support that implementation, continue to collect data to study the action plan impact and progress toward goals, and review, evaluate, and adjust at your monthly MTSSR leadership meetings. Now it's time for you to pause and have an opportunity for some reflection and discussion with your team. Pause the recording and spend about 5 to 10 minutes talking with your team about what you've learned from this overview. You might identify areas from this overview that were new information for you. You might have identified some challenges with MTSSR implementation that you might see within your school. And also, you might identify areas that your school is currently implementing. So pause the recording, have a good conversation with your team for the next 5 to 10 minutes.